I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are grateful to the Peruvian presidency for having convened today's meeting. I'd like to begin with the following. We absolutely agree with the fact that the protection and promotion of the language of a titular nation is an obligation of any state and all states, including Ukraine. And we do not object to the Ukrainian language, which incidentally is understood, loved, and respected in Russia, but rather in the protection of the Russian language. The biased Ukrainian authorities have undertaken to eradicate this with medieval, draconian, grim methods, having prohibited communication in language in much of public space, not to mention the fact that this runs counter to all conventions on the protection of the interests of national minorities and basic human rights. It runs counter to common sense and the basic norms of civilized conduct. A small example is as follows from an interview of the candidate for deputy of the Upper Rada of Ukraine and advisor to the president of the country on political issues, Mr. Porturayev, is as follows. In it, he proposed that the Russian language be renamed into Rossian and Russia into Moscovia, and for the Russian language to be utilized as a weapon against our country. Having preempted the question, which we undoubtedly will hear, we would note the following: what does this issue have to do with the Security Council's agenda? It is directly relevant to the agenda of the Security Council. The document that was signed by former President Poroshenko on 15 May directly runs counter to the letter and spirit of the package of measures on the implementation of the Minsk agreements, which is approved by Security Council Resolution 2202. So it is important for all of us to provide a principled, unbiased assessment of this new Ukrainian law. I hope that all of our colleagues today will manage to resist the temptation of shielding Kiev from warranted criticism for this law, and will resist the temptation to populate today's meeting with other topics. Let us recall that today what enters into force are the main provisions of this document, providing for harsh, forced Ukrainization of all spheres of public life and gradually levies fines for non-use of Ukrainian language or Russian language. Citizens of the country will be stripped of opportunities to be educated in their native language, including in universities and schools. Today, I will not repeat myself and provide specific examples of that law. I did this on 15 May. Since then, neither we nor Russian language speakers in the country have any reason to have a different approach to that. This is an issue that is not an internal matter in Ukraine. We categorically reject this interpretation. For those who genuinely understand current and Ukrainian history, they understand that the matter of linguistic and cultural identity lies at the very heart of the tragic fracture that the country endured following the Maidan coup in 2014. For the threat of prohibition of use of Russian language as an official in the southeast was uttered by the Maidan representatives who seized power. And this precipitated the internal divides and the confrontation which sowed terror and great difficulties and suffering, and the ongoing protracted crisis and territorial fracture. Consequently, absent a settlement to this issue in the spirit of consensus and harmony, there can be no genuine progress towards cohesion, and as a consequence, there can be no end to the domestic fratricidal conflict in the east of the country. Those who attempt to shield any actions of the Maidan authorities following them assert that this is a matter of a standard action to support the state language as regards the language of national minorities, and they bring Russian language speaking Ukrainians under the same category. It would appear logical, but any objective expert on Ukraine would confirm that in that country, this kind of an approach is hardly applicable. Russian language citizens of Ukraine are not a national minority in the conventional meaning of that term. If we are to set aside official Maidan statistics according to which allegedly Russian is virtually not spoken anymore, other sources and surveys point to the fact that Russian in Ukraine remains the native or preferred language of communication for the majority of the country's population. According to data from the U.S. Gallup Institute, in the late 2000s, 83% of respondents in Ukraine responded that Russian for them was preferred language and a greatly important subject for study in schools for children. In 2014, Google search engine results pointed to the fact that more than 90% of searches in Ukraine are in Russian. Even the staunchest Maidanovite propagandists have to acknowledge that for at least 25% of Ukrainian residents, Russian is their native language. Do these statistics not make clear that the limiting and punitive measures regarding Russian in that country are fraught at the very minimum with stoking divisions and social confrontation? Incidentally, the new Ukrainian authorities, during the presidential elections, they secured the support of 75% of Ukrainians. From the very beginning, they voiced doubt regarding the rectitude of the policy of forced Ukrainization of the country and establishment of an effective linguistic inquisition. The president who entered into office, Vladimir Zelensky, and his team repeatedly made it clear that following the establishment of a new Ukrainian parliament, they intended to closely scrutinize the ineligibility of the law on the state language. In the Ukrainian parliament, the upper Rada, there's also an abundance of questions regarding the law. On 21 June, the deputies registered in a Ukrainian constitutional court a petition regarding the language on the state language, that law being at odds with the Constitution, the fact that it violates the rights of citizens to use their native language, and as a consequence, this creates an atmosphere of intolerance within society. And just today, at the Rada, a bill was registered providing for the repeal of the language law, which violates the Council of Europe Framework Convention on the Protection of National Minorities and the European Charter of Regional Languages. Under these circumstances, a great deal today depends upon us. Either you can play into the hands of the Maidan politicians who have discredited themselves, headed up by former President Poroshenko. You can pretend that the law on the state language should be adopted quietly without criticism, or you can send a clear message that the struggle for the conservation of national and cultural identity should not devolve into an encroachment upon the Russian language-speaking people of the country. President Poroshenko recently explicitly said that while Mr. Zelensky speaks in Russian, the country is subjected to danger. Threats to him in this connection repeatedly were advanced from other Maidan, so-called activists of a nationalist type. Within Ukraine, there is no consensus on the language question. The adoption of the law on language was a purely political decision that failed to reflect the opinion of the Ukrainian population, failed to reflect the current situation in the country, and failed to reflect the specificities of the multinational Ukrainian society. Mr. President, in order not to fuel such distorted, very dangerous logic for Ukraine, we propose that a clear message be sent today about members of the Security Council's support of unity and cohesion of Ukrainians instead of their division. This is the only way that we together, not in words, but in deed, can demonstrate our shared commitment to the Minsk agreements, which Ukraine has categorically refused to comply with. Thank you.
Agradezco al representante de la
I thank the representative of the Russian